Greetings, dear listeners. If you've been following Wisdom of Crowds closely, you'll know that in the last few weeks we've been very preoccupied with the question of whether and to what extent the United States is entering a constitutional crisis. Damir and Shadi have discussed several times now the possibility that it's the judiciary branch which is what's standing between us and autocracy. In order to understand whether this is actually true, whether the courts can forestall a constitutional crisis, we've invited Samuel Moyn back on the podcast. Moyn is a professor of law and history at Yale University and the author of several books, including Humane, How the United States Abandoned Peace and Reinvented War, and Liberalism Against Itself, Cold War Intellectuals in the Making of Our Times. He's also the author of a recent article saying that, no, unfortunately, the courts cannot save American democracy. We discussed that article in the episode. It's a timely and intense hour that you will not want to miss. Before we get started, a reminder to head on over to wisdomofcrowds.live and consider becoming a paid subscriber if you're not one yet. You'll get access to, among other things, the whole conversation, along with other subscriber-only benefits. And don't forget to give us a like and review on your favorite podcast app. With all that out of the way, on to the show.
Sam Moyn, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, look, you asked right before I hit record what we're going to be talking about, and I said, hold on a second, let me hit record, and I can tell you. I think that what's on everyone's mind is how bad things are, how bad things are getting, how bad things can get. The state of the nation, the state of our democracy with Trump, and the brinksmanship with the courts specifically. And, you have a really good piece last week in the Washington Post that I'm very glad we got. And I do want to talk about that, but because you do have, I think, a very a unique and smart approach to thinking about the broader crisis in our democracy. But I also want to start, before we get to that bigger picture, I'd love to just sort of get your sense to get us started outside of that bigger picture of, the role of the courts and our perhaps over-reliance on courts. I want to just sort of get your sense about how worried you are in general about where things are right now. Because the way I see things, and I think Shadi and I were talking about this last week, is that this is a fight over the legitimacy. I mean, Congress just feels like it's out of the picture at this point. They've taken themselves out of the picture, willingly. I mean, longer secular trend of decline of the relevance of Congress. But it feels like it's a fight between, the courts maintaining some kind of, moral democratic legitimacy of their own in the face of this populist, demagogic executive at this point. So how bad is it? I mean, or maybe you don't even see it that way, but I mean, how worried are you, I guess? Let's start that way. How worried are you in the situation we're at right now?
Well, I want to strive for some, nuance, and how bad is it could be asking whether we've crossed a critical threshold, or it could be asking where are we on a continuum, with a lot of runway to go to, fascism or totalitarianism, or, democracy dying in darkness, or whatever whatever the nether pole is. And I guess I want to say American history is much worse along many dimensions than a lot of people are willing to kind of confront. And so there's this baseline question: compared to what? And then there's this, I think, most important question, since I think we still have a democracy of some sort, which is how we got here and what it would take to salvage the situation, in a sense, before it's too late, before the critical threshold has been crossed, if it hasn't been, or before we're too far down the continuum. But all that said, your Trump 2.0 is not the same in a number of really important respects. And I myself felt that most clearly with the arrest of Mahmoud Khalil, although there's also a lot of continuities between that executive action and things that have been done, distantly and recently in U.S. history. So I don't want to be someone who's coming off as minimizing or trivializing how bad it is. I think the question is, what can we do? What is the best strategy and response? Which is partly like, how do we diagnose? And above all, I do want to caution against over-reliance on courts in this critical moment.
Go ahead, Shadi.
Yes, and can you say more about the baseline? Because I think for those of us who weren't alive in previous periods, yes, a lot of us simply are unaware of how bad America was at critical moments. Obviously, we all know about the Civil War, Jim Crow. Those are the obvious ones, but there's also less obvious ones, like the internment of Japanese Americans, for example. But there's really a whole list of things, sure, and undermining of civil liberties, the Red Scare during the Cold War, where people were accused of communist sympathies, maybe similar to what Trump is doing with those with pro-Palestinian sympathies.
Yes.
But at the same time, are those the relevant benchmarks? Because I think there's a sense that in the post-Cold War period, things were supposed to be different. History had ended. We don't do things like that anymore. We're a different kind of country. Of course, there was the post 9/11 period, so that sort of undermines that. But why do you think there is this kind of myopia when it comes to always thinking that our moment is the worst and not having more of that historical perspective?
Well, I mean, I think narcissism is the straight answer, that we're alive now, and what matters to us is, the tyranny of our moment, for very obvious reasons. And in a sense, we can't change the past, but in theory, we could change the future unless we paralyze ourselves through anxiety and fear. So to me, it's legitimate to be presentist. I'm not claiming we should look back as a salve that the past was like so much worse, although it often was. And your list was great, but I'd throw in the history of immigration restriction in this country, especially between the later 19th century in response to Asian migration, and then in the interwar period with respect to like my people. That really changed only in the 1960s, and we can interpret our moment as a kind of backlash to a long era of relatively more open borders in a neoliberal period. So I guess I want to say, like, I don't want to deny the importance of getting things right prospectively. The only use of the past is for that end. And when I look back, I'm saying, let's try to understand why things broke before. I totally agree. We need to avoid the complacent belief that many of us absorbed living through the 90s, that none of this could ever happen again. But it's not that anyone ever thought it hadn't happened before in the 90s, and we really need to overcome this sense that there was a permanent break. Actually, there are cycles, and a lot has to do with economic choices that actually began before 1989 and continues since. So that's my ultimate level of explanation if you want to get into that. But the main thing is that false beliefs were cultivated, a mistaken baseline, and then we didn't realize that like our choices were leading us back to some of the horror that we kind of need to see more clearly about, humanity and about American history and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, look, I bring this up all the time. It's because in the 90s, the Balkans were tearing themselves apart at a moment where history was supposed to end, which is why the whole end of history thing always seemed like a crock of shit to me. Right. And the idea of like moral progress and the rest of this is just grounded for me in that, because like all the, the tut-tutting progressive European and American elites were like, no, you savages, this is in the past. And I think it was Ivan Krastev, who we had on a couple of weeks ago, pointed out to, I think it was at your house, Shadi, when we had him, we had that book party for him many years ago now. He said to me once, he's like, the funny thing is everyone thought that the Balkans were some sort of echo, like barbaric echo of the past, but in fact it was a harbinger of the future. Yes. And I think that's, to me, I'm not surprised by any of that. And quite frankly, these questions about like, we thought we were better, but now we're worse, actually don't resonate with me. I mean, there's a little bit of self-satisfaction to me when I hear this. But the reason I say that as a parenthesis is like, I mean, we can talk more about that if you guys are interested in doing that. But what I'm really interested in is the question of institutional peril that we find ourselves in, because I think that to me is what keeps me laser focused and sort of anxious about the current moment, and that I find the hardest to diagnose. Because again, I do think there's a lot of presentism involved in that too. We like to venerate the Constitution and think that it's a static constitutional order, but that's actually not true. And I think this is a big part of what you write about, Sam, like, what kind of decline and where we've gotten as a democracy as a result of that. But, you mentioned that the Khalil thing was particularly disturbing and a wake-up call to you. And I can totally understand that in terms of the sort of like moral historical timeline of that. But as far as like the constitutional order, I found the deportation of the Venezuelans and shunting them off to some Salvadoran prison and the legal wranglings that have emerged after that to be far more dangerous, put it that way, as far as the constitutional order. Is that right? Am I right about that? Or would you say, it's all part of the sort of the same thing, and the Khalil thing should be perhaps just as troubling to us as that? Or is the Venezuela, El Salvador thing really like a step further into the breach than the rest of the stuff?
Well, just to explain why you're coming up with that ranking, what is constitutionally offensive to you about the El Salvador thing?
It's not. Constitutionally offensive. It's that it seems to me that I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a constitutional scholar. But it seems to me as a layperson that the Venezuela stuff was a bigger overreach. All of it has been degrees of pushing the limit, obviously.
I see.
The strategy seems to me to find the kind of places and cases that are, divisive, polarizing, threshold, and can shift the balance usefully in the direction of the executive as these things wend their ways up from the lower courts to the upper courts, and hoping that the Supreme Court will rule more or less, shifting the balance. The Overton window shifts a little bit, all the rest of this. The Venezuela case seems like, just like a fever dream of Stephen Miller of some sort. Let's find this, this law that was been invoked in particularly odious moments in our history, that we're not even at war, like really overstretching it. And then, but this is the part that worries me, never mind finding that loophole, but then seemingly, using the law in ways to almost evade habeas corpus, rushing to, knowing that you're going to run afoul of this, rushing to throw these people into prison, where a foreign prison, where they may not ever be found again. People, many of people are just like not accounted for at this point, and then seemingly daring the Supreme Court to try to smack them down at this point. That seems to me a lot bigger. The Khalil stuff, ugly, nasty. He's getting due process of sorts, even though they're venue shopping. It's going to be contested, but it seemed to me in that one they are doing what they've been doing in all the other cases, which is at least playing ball in the lower courts and trying to make some kind of legal argument. And the legal argument that I've seen in the Venezuela thing is, again, I'm not a lawyer, seems particularly flimsy, absurd, and just designed as a dare to the Supreme Court to try to smack down the executive, which they seem to be feeling their oats and is popular, and the rest of this. So I don't know. That's my feeling on it. I don't know. What do you think?
I think it's a fair ranking. I mean, I think if you're just interested in at the level of outcomes, first your case affected more people, and it's a fait accompli now to some extent. Whereas Khalil's case, it's there are a few others who have been targeted, but he's not out of the country, and it's making its way through the courts. I guess I wouldn't draw as bright a line between the flimsiness of the legal claims in the one case and the other, because it seems as if the law is made to be rediscovered and reinterpreted in real time, and it's Congress that has left old laws on the books that grant the executive frightening levels of discretion over human beings, including people on the brink of American citizenship. And so I'm not seeing that one. I'd argue that there are colorable claims apparently about the gang in the one case, whereas literally Khalil is being disappeared because of his free speech, which can be overridden, but does accrue to non-citizens who are permanent residents. So from that perspective, it's worse. I would say I wouldn't play the sweepstakes of which has crossed a threshold. I think Shadi's right that there have been horrible events in the past on the basis of the very law that was used in the Venezuelan case, including Japanese internment, and then there's the McCarthyite period, which is, I think, an excellent analogy for what's happening to Khalil, and there were deportations basically on ideological grounds in that era. So I think the courts may have a tough time. Now, they have some powers to try to play politics of their own, but in the end, these are statutes authorizing the president frightening discretion, and the end of history left those statutes intact. Mm-hmm. So to me, that's what we should talk about. And then, inevitably, especially when there's, economic crisis, populist backlash, whatever, like a new era of immigration restrictionists and scapegoating human beings, you're gonna have politicians that volunteer to test the viability of these old laws and challenge the courts. And so if we're not continuing to ponder the underlying causation, then we're not really nipping this in the bud and ultimately demanding Congress deal with these noxious statutes on the books. So I don't know. I'm not sure. I guess I would challenge you to defend why it's the priority now to pick and choose which is the really noxious thing that Trump has done. And maybe it's because we need to decry the fact that he's crossed a critical threshold or headed too far down the continuum, but maybe we need to understand the continuum and what's driving it.
I take your point. I guess I'm worried about, because the word on everyone's lips a couple of weeks ago, and I think it, at the time I thought was overdone, and with the Venezuela case, I'm wondering if it's getting there. It's just constitutional crisis.
Yes.
Again, I'm trying to separate out the moral concern from actually a very mechanical one, which is, again, and this is what I guess is at the root of my question. You guys talked about former, moral depravities in our history. Maybe what I'm asking is, talk to me about constitutional crises in our history that get us to this point. I mean, Jackson has been mined a fair bit about how far he pushed it. Right. That was a long time ago at this point. FDR is the other one that really rewired things, and we have different memories, I think historical memories of one versus the other, which also tells us a lot about ourselves today. But I guess it's my question here is one of the durability of the regime, if you will.
Yes.
Whether again, I agree with you. Democracy dies in darkness. All that. That's glib sloganeering, but it is something that Shadi and I do talk about a lot on this podcast.
Yes.
Is what is a democracy? What is a minimal democracy? What is our constitutional order look like on the other side of this? Is it democratic? When do we slip down from that?
Yes.
I'm really interested to see Shadi, what's the Swedish survey, democracy survey thing, V something.
VDEM, yeah.
VDEM, yeah. I want to see where we end up on that next year, right? But and I did see, I think, some statistic that last year's survey, that's the Democratic decline is absolutely global. But leave that aside. Where does this leave us? I guess is what keeps me up at night. And I take your point about free speech rights, the chilling nature of this. Again, the McCarthy comparison is very apt because Trump's mentor, right, Roy Cohn was right in the heart and center of that. So we shouldn't perhaps be surprised about any of that stuff. So I guess my nudge back to you is again on the constitutional order, on whether you think we are headed towards a place where the Trump administration, emboldened by earlier whatevers and feeling that the court can be rolled, at this point has picked the Venezuela case as the one that they're going to try and really take throw a brick at Robert's head. And, what does that mean? Is it just more of the same and, shouldn't be that worried about it? Or, I don't know. That's where I'm coming from at it again.
It's totally fair. I guess, I'm averse to the constitutional crisis rhetoric, and it's true it spiked not long ago, mainly because it spiked before, and same with fascism. And it seems as if partly these words had, much less analytically clear content than I would like from the start, but also they've been overused, maybe prematurely, such that they don't help us, discern what's new. Above all, they don't tell us what to do, other than pray that the honorable court will save the Constitution. Has it ever done that? So I guess we're talking about, what is the threshold beyond which democracy is irretrievable. Now, I honestly think you really mean liberalism, and most people who have complained about democracy dying in darkness mean liberalism. But that also begs a lot of questions about how do we know what it is, how do we know when it's gone, what the critical threshold is, how far down the continuum are we. I mean, I would say the things that if you take very basic political theory accounts of democracy, minimalist theories like Joseph Schumpeter, do we have elections that are competitive in which the loser departs and the winner takes power. And I'm down with saying January 6th for that reason was the scariest thing that has happened. Attacking, minorities and political enemies, including through questionably legal means, is nowhere near implying that we've lost that minimal conception of democracy. It does suggest that liberalism is eroding. Liberal values, very basic ones, and yet then I'm with Shadi. I'm not suggesting he's with me. That have we ever had liberal democracy to a remotely credible extent in this country? Well, no. So then we're backsliding relative to a baseline we shouldn't have, felt was secure and stable to begin with. And so I guess I want to say, like, I'm not with you that the Venezuelan case is like stinking to high heaven in a way that the prior stuff was leaving us not alarmed. I mean, my position has always been we should have already been alarmed, and then we have some stuff down the continuum. But I guess I haven't seen, even in the Khalil case, something that is convincing me that we're on the brink of regime change in the sense of 1933 or other examples in history.
So Sam, I really do appreciate your emphasis on a minimalistic approach to democracy and the fact that, again, a lot of folks are conflating liberalism with democracy. And that's just been a problem in American discourse for God knows how long. I mean, for my entirety of my adult life, it is really frustrating. Yes. And you're right that no one is really, at least to my knowledge, I haven't seen many seriously questioning whether we can have a free election in 2028 where Democrats have a reasonable shot of winning. I mean, maybe that'll change, but at least for the time being, I don't think that's really what folks are exercised about. But I just want to turn now to the question of, as you put it, what to do now. What is available to us in terms of redress. And I think your view has been that the courts cannot save us. And that's not your view just recently. I think you've been making that argument for several years now, and you've been one of the most consistent and outspoken voices for that position. And if people want to get a general sense of Sam's argument on that, I would highly recommend the piece that Damir mentioned in the Washington Post from last week. We'll include a link to that in the show notes. Maybe just give us a brief summary of the argument and why you have this strong feeling about the courts and how they can't save us. Because it seems to me they're doing, I'll just say, it seems to me, look, they're not a long-term solution.
Right.
But when I look at our current moment, I have to say, I think to myself daily now, thank God for the judicial branch. Thank the Lord, because without them, we wouldn't have had this counterweight. And so I'm willing to take wins where I can find them. And again, yes, sure, they can't save us, but at least they can make things less bad.
Yes. Well, I totally agree that we should take wins where we can find them. And the piece actually says strategic wins are make the world better, especially in the short term. So with that concession, the piece is more about, well, how do we analyze first how courts brought us to this situation and participated in its creation, and then what's the nature of the victory in the short term that they can provide, so that we know like where else we might need to look. And if you want just a contrast with my argument, you can look at the New York Times op-ed on a similar topic. by a kind of never Trump conservative former federal judge. And the argument there is the decisive test of whether American democracy lives or dies is whether Donald Trump follows court orders generally, but Supreme Court decisions particularly. So we're not there, and like everything's at stake. Yeah. And we're trying to kind of say, of course, winning matters at every level of the judicial system and in politics, generally. But if we really stake everything on a Supreme Court decision that Donald Trump accepts, I think we're setting ourselves up for either extremely limited victories or dreadful, reversals. And so our piece basically says, first, courts can't do a lot. And we show even in the examples of current controversies how the wins that you refer to have themselves been very partial. Then we, rehearse how, especially with respect to Trump's firings and, Doge slash and burn politics, the Supreme Court, not just courts generally, but that pinnacle institution has set up current events basically by empowering the president through kind of edging nearer and nearer to a unitary executive theory. So it's widely speculated, and not just by my co-author Ryan Dorfler and me, that these cases will be, where the court continues to head in the direction it's been heading in recent years, which is letting the president have more and more power over his servants, as they would see them in the executive branch, even with respect to agencies headed by multiple members, and even with respect to civil service protections. And so it's not that you can't win in the Supreme Court, but, as we saw in his first term with the travel ban, judicial processes, including in Trump v. Hawaii, can kind of launder, radical political change. And also, even when the courts put up resistance, it's not clear, how much they are going to ever put up in the end. And so that's why our stance is, why are we not, looking for alternatives, if not in the short term, since fair enough, Democrats don't control House, Senate, or presidency, then in a medium or long term, starting, I would say, in 2026 with the midterm elections, which are probably decisive. Yeah.
Doesn't that depend entirely on Democrats winning in the midterms or in 2028? If they don't, you're going to have a Republican Party that is broadly unified around the idea of a unitary executive for the foreseeable future. So it's just dependent on something that, we just don't know if that's going to happen. I mean, God willing, it will. But if Republicans continue to dominate both houses of Congress, then we will have to look elsewhere. We can't rely on Congress. Congress will have abdicated its responsibilities. It already has.
Well, a couple things, because that's a tremendously important point. First is on whether the Republicans are actually unified and how they act. So I think their unity has been vastly overstated by kind of the anxious and fearful, to whom it serves to say they're in lockstep with Trump and always have been, because we saw who stopped January 6th. Well, it was Trump's Attorney General and Mitch McConnell, not to mention Mike Pence. If we're concerned about January 6th, they're American heroes, and they're all Republicans. And we when we look at Congress, yes, they have the majority, but we start our op-ed with this extraordinary thing that Susan Collins said, where she announces her vote in favor of Russell Vogt at Office of Management and Budget, and she says, well, yes, I disagree with everything he's going to do, but I defer, as a practice in this great American democracy, to the president's right to appoint his officials. And fortunately, I just, can rely on the courts to stop all of the policies he represents with which I disagree. Well, that's outrageous. I mean, that's an abdication of her responsibility, which, breeds this over-reliance on courts. And, there are some Republicans, even, in our moment, who do bitterly disagree with where Trump is taking the country. And they're the ones who matter, even now, before 2026. But I guess, then I'd say that, you're speaking as if, the fact that Democrats aren't winning decisive elections as like this other thing that's someone else's problem, when actually the point of us who've been resisting the doomsaying since 2016 is that elections are the thing that are going to save us. And that means that the Democrats have to find a popular project and stop putting up failed candidates. And so, to me, the main question is, are we, in a sense, wasting time or squandering an opportunity to have the fight over the future of liberalism that we would need to actually have success in 2026 or 2028? Now, of course, in the end, you're right, that if whatever happens, that fight occurs and the Democrats still lose, then we're screwed, because, permanent Republican control of all the political branches of government, should that be the outcome, mean, that they get to rule the country, however their leaders decide.
The thing that's tough for me on this, again, is I've been reading you for a while, and we've had you on it several times, so I know exactly where you're coming from. But I still keep coming back to this question, right? Like the question of the unitary executive that you brought up.
Yes,
it's a real one. That is to say, it exists on an arguable spectrum of these things. You mentioned articles talking about, I think Jack Goldsmith had one not too long ago that was very good, saying that how much what the immunity ruling, which is I think what we had you on last time to talk about, how much that has just emboldened the executive to what they're doing, everything that they're doing right now, and it's in the background of every argument that they're making is that. That said, the question of what Doge is doing, prudentially aside, at least to me, from the outside, it doesn't seem like a slam dunk, constitutional outrage. The extent to which, the executive, maybe, between the two articles of the Constitution, I don't know where the line falls of like what they can and can't do, and that is what's being adjudicated right now. I guess what I'm getting at is that what strikes me about your argument, which I'd maybe push you on, where I think that the New York Times Never Trump judge gets at it a little better, is that like maybe we should just think of everything as politics, not think of like the courts as not being political. You alluded to it earlier as well. Yes. It's that it's all about legitimacy. It's all about maintaining legitimacy and exercising power. Now, it's true that the executive has a different means of exercising power as opposed to the courts. And we think that the courts, especially the Supreme Court, being, lifetime appointments, they're somehow meant to be non-political, but the best Supreme Court justices understand the inherently political role of what they're doing, and behave in the same sort of way. And so again, it comes back to me this question that if Trump doesn't obey the Supreme Court, we are in a different world. Fundamentally, it feels to me like we are. Maybe we're not. Maybe you'd say, well, whatever, it's not a big deal. And I've seen people say, arguably, that Biden towed the line on ignoring the Supreme Court on the student loan stuff at some point. I didn't look into that deeply enough to be able to adjudicate that one way or the other. But okay, so there's always been some sort of level of brinksmanship at that level, and maybe it's been getting worse and worse. But getting back to politics again, I feel like your argument is absolutely correct about, down the line and the politics of 2026 and the rest of that. But what are the politics of the current moment?
Yes,
And I think, one thing that seems really important to me right now, and again, fall back to why I think the Venezuela stuff is a bigger deal, is that if that does go to the Supreme Court quickly, that Roberts gets a 9-0 and just smacks them down like a backhand across the mouth, their little pretty mouths, so they bleed a little bit. And just that politically would be very important, because the politics of that moment, a 9-0 smack across the face that draws blood, will set up a political dynamic that's different, perhaps in Congress, will perhaps embolden some of these Republicans that are cowed right now by the threat of Musk funding some kind of insurgent campaign, that they're no longer in control of their party and the rest of that. And the gamble there is that Americans still have vestigial enough respect for the idea of the Supreme Court that a 9-0 rebuke of Trump will be politically hurtful, that will then open a political door for an opposition, not just Democrats, but Republicans also, to say, like, hey, this guy's like over the line, man, over the line, dude. From Lebowski, right? So I don't know. What do you make of that? Like,
I love that hypo, but maybe it's illuminating where we might have different priorities. Because first, I totally agree that outright defiance of a Supreme Court decision would be a big deal, no doubt about it. And even though I could get into why it's credible to say Joe Biden defied the Supreme Court. I mean, is it really that different to say, no, I'm obeying the Supreme Court, but I'm going to find a different statute that allegedly authorizes the same policy they just knocked down? Well, then Trump's going to do the same thing. Yeah. And Ryan and I have a piece in Dissent, which you can link to, that was a Biden-era piece called "We Are Already Defying the Supreme Court," suggesting that, well, no, maybe it's not a big deal. It's always been, this negotiation that I alluded to before. But all that said, I totally agree with you. We have not seen like an outright confrontation lately. And so and I also agree with you that should one come about, Trump is likely going to lose it, because there is this reservoir of, blind fidelity to the institutional importance of the Supreme Court. And so I totally agree with you that when the time is right, on the right issue, the justices can strike a blow. I doubt that Roberts can get to 9-0 on that issue. I think it's maybe slightly more credible on the birthright citizenship matter, although there's a lot of intricacy on that, and it might be that he can't get to 9-0 there. But here's the thing: what matters? Trump might well, not kind of reach that situation because he's not an idiot. And if you're right, and I agree with you, then you'll take what you can get from the Supreme Court and you'll avoid confrontation. And here's the thing: the Supreme Court is going to give him a lot.
Yeah, I agree.
And maybe on the Venezuela case, I'm not exactly sure what you think is so legally noxious about it, notwithstanding the age of the law, and John Roberts in Trump v. Hawaii would not overrule Korematsu, the decision that authorized the Japanese internment. He said it's been overruled by history. In a decision laundering the racist travel ban because Trump had added a few countries to the list. Yeah. And so we're looking for the right case, and we may never get it. And in the meantime, the Supreme Court is giving Trump a lot, pushing back in minor ways. And so to me, that's the more likely scenario than your hypothetical. And if I turn out to be right, and of course I've been wrong many times, then what will impress us about this period of history is that the confrontation didn't happen, but that we went down the continuum with the assistance and support of the Supreme Court.
But it does help that in this case, the Supreme Court is a conservative court.
Yes.
Can you imagine if it was a liberal court? I think that would set up a more dangerous situation where, but if conservatives sort of push back hard on Trump's designs, then I think, as you sort of mentioned already, it'll embolden Republicans because they can say, well, this is our side. These are fellow conservatives. So we feel good about this decision, where I think there would be a very strong temptation if it was a liberal court to attack the legitimacy of the court and the standing of the court in ways that were very partisan and very ugly. So that's one thing sort of counterintuitively we can be relieved about, even if we're not conservatives. But I did want to just, as a brief aside, just for my own clarity, because I find it kind of intriguing, the 1798 or 89.
That's it for part one, dear listeners. There's a lot more where that came from. If you're not yet a paying subscriber, please head on over to wisdomofcrowds.live and become one. Help support our work. Hope to see you in the bonus.